Europe was a barbaric wasteland filled with tribes of people who lived in huts and had never seen an indoor toilet when suddenly a new power swept across the continent. These were not your average barbarians. They were dark-skinned, highly intelligent, well-traveled, and well-spoken. They had come from across the sea to teach the Europeans everything they knew about science, math, art, and architecture. The newcomers were the Black Moors. In this episode, we'll be going over how the Black Moors took Europe from this to this in just a few short years. So without further ado, let's get into it. The Moors had conquered most of Spain by the year 714 AD. However, the region that they ruled was known as Al-Andalus and encompassed much more than just Spain. It included parts of France, Portugal, and even North Africa. At their peak, they controlled nearly all of the Iberian Peninsula and parts of Italy. The Moors settled down in Europe for a few reasons. One was because they wanted to spread Islam, and the other was because of the wealth that the Europeans had. When the Moors arrived in Europe, they encountered a variety of different people. There were the Visigoths, the Franks, the Byzantines, the Lombards, and the English, among others. All of these people spoke different languages and followed different customs. However, they all had one thing in common. They were uncivilized. The Europeans were living in the Dark Ages and were far behind the rest of the world in terms of technology and culture. This would change when the Moors arrived. As soon as the Moors began interacting with the Europeans, they realized that they had a lot to teach them. The Europeans were fascinated by Moorish culture and eagerly adopted many of their customs, including their language. In fact, the influence of Arabic on European languages is so great that many scholars believe that without the Moors, French, German, and Italian would sound very different today. The Moors were also responsible for introducing the Europeans to some of their scientific and mathematical knowledge. For example, the Moors taught the Europeans about algebra and geometry. They also introduced them to new technologies such as the astrolabe and the compass. In addition, the Moors helped to preserve Greek and Roman texts, which had been lost to the rest of Europe during the Dark Ages. This allowed the Europeans to rediscover ancient Greek philosophy and start the Renaissance. In addition to their contributions to science and mathematics, the Moors also made great contributions to art and architecture. For example, they built some of the most beautiful mosques and palaces in Europe, such as the Great Mosque of Cordoba and the Alhambra. Their influence can also be seen in European paintings and sculptures, which often feature Moorish patterns and designs. Perhaps the most important contribution of the Moors was their introduction of agriculture to Europe. When the Moors first arrived in Europe, they found that the land was largely uncultivated. Most of the food that the Europeans ate was imported from the Byzantine Empire or North Africa. However, the Moors changed all that by introducing new crops such as rice, sugarcane, and cotton. They also developed new farming techniques that allowed them to grow more food on less land. This, in turn, led to population growth and urbanization. The Moors ruled over Europe for centuries, and during that time they completely changed the continent. They introduced the Europeans to science, mathematics, art, and architecture. They also helped to preserve ancient Greek texts and introduce new crops to the region. Without the Moors, Europe would have remained a barbaric wasteland for many more centuries. It may surprise you to know that black people were the ones who taught white Europeans about civilization, but it's a fact. You see, the Moors weren't just any ordinary people. They were highly intelligent and well-traveled. They had come from across the sea to teach the Europeans everything they knew about science, math, art, and architecture. When the Moors arrived in Europe, they were met with resistance from the local populations. The Franks, Visigoths, and Byzantines were suspicious of these dark-skinned foreigners and their strange customs. But over time, the Moors won the Europeans over with their advanced knowledge and sophisticated culture. One of the first things the Moors did was introduce the Europeans to Islam. This was a monotheistic religion that emphasized reason and tolerance, which was a stark contrast to the polytheism and superstition that was prevalent in Europe at the time. Many Europeans were attracted to Islam and converted to the faith, including some members of the Frankish royal family. The Moors also made great contributions to science and mathematics. They introduced the Europeans to algebra, geometry, and astronomy. They also taught them how to use the astrolabe and the compass, which are instruments used for navigation. These scientific and mathematical advances helped to lay the foundation for the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. Another important contribution of the Moors was their preservation of classical texts. As I mentioned earlier, the Moors ruled over southern Europe for several centuries, and during that time they collected and copied many ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been lost to the rest of Europe. They also helped to preserve these texts when Europe entered the Dark Ages after the fall of Rome. This preserved knowledge allowed the Renaissance to flourish when it did. But perhaps the most important contribution of the Moors was their introduction of agriculture to Europe. When the Moors arrived in Europe, they found that the land was largely uncultivated. Most of the food that Europeans ate was imported from the Byzantine Empire or North Africa. However, the Moors changed all that by introducing new crops such as rice, sugarcane, and cotton. They also developed new farming techniques that allowed them to grow more food on less land. This, in turn, led to population growth and urbanization. Overall, the Moors were a highly intelligent and advanced civilization. They made significant contributions to science, mathematics, art, and architecture, as well as agriculture and the preservation of classical texts. Without the Moors, Europe would have remained a barbaric wasteland for many more centuries. Now let's look at the timeline of how the Moors civilized Europe. In 711 AD, the Moors crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and began conquering the Iberian Peninsula. Within a few years, they had defeated the Visigoths and established control over most of Spain. During this time, they also began to push northward into France. In 732 AD, the Moors reached their furthest point north when they advanced into Aquitaine. They were eventually defeated by a coalition of Frankish and Visigoth forces at the Battle of Tours. This marked the beginning of the decline of Moorish power in Europe. However, the Moors continued to hold on to their territories in Spain and Portugal for several more centuries. During this time, they built some of the most beautiful mosques and palaces in Europe, such as the Great Mosque of Córdoba and the Alhambra. In the early 1000s, the Moors began to lose territory to the Christians. By the year 1000, the Moors only controlled a small part of southern Spain. However, they continued to thrive culturally and intellectually. In the 1100s, the Moors began to lose their last strongholds in Spain. By the end of the century, the entire Iberian Peninsula was under Christian rule. However, the legacy of the Moors lived on in Europe. Their contributions to science, mathematics, art, and architecture had a lasting impact on the continent. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. We've got plenty more videos on our channel covering African history and other topics. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.